This message is a presentation of Pinnacle Baptist Church and the preaching ministry of Pastor Ray McBarry. Other messages like this are available online at pinnaclebaptist.com. The church is located at 2517 High Falls Road in Griffin, Georgia. If you're in the area, we would love for you to visit us this Sunday. Now, here's today's message.
We're in Daniel chapter 5 tonight because we did not finish the entire chapter last week. We had some background information, and then we got part of the way through chapter 5. But tonight, Lord willing, we'll finish up Daniel chapter number 5. It's an exciting story because it's one of those interesting things that happens, including a miracle in the Old Testament. I don't think anyone could picture the story of a hand appearing and writing on the plaster in the wall without that being somewhat exciting and of interest. And we got down last week to finding out what the message was and what the message means. And we're going to pick back up there in just a moment in verse number 17. But before we do that, I want to backtrack just a little bit to verse 13. And remind us that the king now who is sitting on the throne there in Babylon is Belshazzar. He is the grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, by this point, has passed away. Belshazzar is sitting on the throne in Babylon because his own father, who is actually the current king of Babylon, is away fighting at war. He's away from the city. So Belshazzar is the acting king, if we could call him that, of Babylon. But he's the one that's sitting on the throne there. And while his father is away with the army at war, the city of Babylon is besieged. But Belshazzar wasn't too worried about that because of the protection of the mighty walls of Babylon. We spent a good deal of time last week talking about how huge the walls were that surrounded the city of Babylon. And huge walls, so wide, in fact, that they could have chariot races on top of the walls, 4 chariots wide, and the walls went on and on and on around the city. The city itself was 14 square miles that was enclosed with a double wall with a moat in between the double wall. The outer wall was 87 feet high, 87 feet wide, 350 feet high. That's 35 stories high. That's quite a wall. It had 100 gates, and the gates themselves were spaced out periodically around the city. But in addition to the gates, which had towers, there were hundreds of towers spaced periodically around the walls that were 100 feet above the height of the wall. So if the wall itself was 350 feet high, that means these towers were 450 feet tall. That's a 45-story skyscraper. These are some amazing walls with the towers all around them. There's a reason that the city of Babylon had not fallen to a siege in more than 1,000 years. It's because not only was the wall impregnable, but they had fresh water that flowed through the city under the wall with the Euphrates River. It flowed in one side and out the other under the walls. And so they had a constant supply of fresh water. The area of the city was so large that was surrounded by the wall that they could grow their own food if they ate up what was already stored in the city. So it was very difficult for any invading army to besiege the city, and no one had successfully taken the city through siege in more than 1,000 years. So that's where we are. There's an army outside the wall when chapter 5 begins. It's the army of the Medes and the Persians. But like we just said, just because there's an army camped outside the wall was really no big deal as far as Belshazzar was concerned. He didn't think there was any way they could get through or over the wall, so he wasn't too worried about it. In fact, not only was he not worried about it, but while his city was besieged by an enemy army, he's in there hosting a feast, a banquet, partying it up with 1,000 of the lords. Of course, this was not the kind of party that you or I would want to be a part of. There was all kinds of immorality going on. There was drinking going on. We really don't know what all was going on. We'll leave that to the imagination. But in the midst of all of the immorality and the drunkenness that was going on, Belshazzar had the audacity to have the vessels of gold and silver that had previously been brought out of Jerusalem from the temple, and he had them brought in for he and his buddies to drink alcohol from. Now, these are vessels that had been used in the house of God, Solomon's temple, back in Jerusalem. Apparently, his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, when he had those things removed from the temple, he had them put somewhere in storage in the city of Babylon, among all of the other things he had captured and conquered. But he had, to the best of our knowledge, never had the audacity of his grandson here, who then takes the vessels of worship of God and turns them into something for his drunken orgy there in the city of Babylon in the king's palace. It was a blasphemy against God, and they were drinking to the false gods of Babylon. We've talked about some of those false gods and goddesses of Babylon. We won't go back through all that. But that is all taking place when over against the wall, the king sees a hand begin to write in the plaster. TR and I debated all week off and on about, was King Belshazzar the only one who could see the hand, or could the other people see the hand too? The Bible doesn't really tell us. It just tells us that the king saw the hand and that he was so terrified, the Bible says his knees smote one against another, just like those old cartoons or the Three Stooges where they're so frightened their knees literally knock one against another. But he called in all the wise men and they couldn't tell him what it says. So let's pick back up with verse 13. We'll read down through 16 as a summary of where we left off, and then we'll pick up new with verse 17. Verse 13 says, Then was Daniel brought in before the king. And the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I've heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. So he offers Daniel 3 different rewards if he can read the writing and give the interpretation of it. The first thing he offers is that he would be clothed with scarlet. These are very expensive clothes, undoubtedly out of the king's wardrobe itself. This would have been signifying royalty. Scarlet-colored clothes were rare in those days. It was very precious if there was a garment that was a brightly colored garment, red or purple. Most of the time, those dyes used for those clothes were made from different types of sea creatures along the coast there, and the dyes were very expensive and very rare. The Phoenicians were well known for their purple dyes down along the sea coast just north of Israel. So not just anybody could have worn brightly colored clothes like this. So the clothes would have been a symbol of royalty. Number 2 was the chain of gold about his neck. Just the weight of the gold itself would have been of value, but undoubtedly it would have had some stamp on it or some etching to show that this had previously belonged to the king and the king's family, which would make it all the more a valuable thing to own. Who could put a price on a gold chain that had belonged to the king's family. That would have been of great value. It also would have signified that he had the authority of the king to be wearing it. And then the third thing that he offered here is that Daniel would be made the third ruler in the kingdom. And we talked about the fact that last week that the reason he's offering him the position of number 3 in the kingdom is because Belshazzar, sitting in as the king on duty there in Babylon, he was the number 2 ruler in the kingdom. His daddy, who was away at war, was the number 1 ruler in the kingdom. He was number 2, so the highest position he had to offer was number 3 in the kingdom. And that's what he offers to Daniel. That brings us down now to where we left off, which is verse 17, and we'll pick up from there. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation." Interesting here, Daniel is being offered these very expensive, luxurious gifts that show the king's authority behind them. And Daniel's response is what our response ought to be when the world comes offering us gifts that they bear. And that is, keep your gifts. I'd rather not have them. Give them to someone else. These are things that to King Belshazzar are of great value. But Daniel says, keep your gifts. I think it's interesting because as we go on and we read on in the chapter here, we're going to find out that the gifts that Belshazzar had to offer at best were very temporary gifts. And Daniel has the wisdom to decline the gifts of the world. We would do wise to realize ourselves that anything the world has to offer is but temporary, and we would do well to decline the gifts of the world just like Daniel did. Number 18, O thou king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. So right away he begins talking about God. Just like he did each time he interpreted those dreams for Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel is very clear that God is the one who should get the glory. Not Daniel, but God. He says, God gave your father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. Nebuchadnezzar had to learn that lesson the hard way himself, didn't he? Remember chapter 4 where we talked about his heart being turned to the heart of a beast for 7 years. He continues in verse 19, and for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he slew. And whom he would, he kept alive. And whom he would, he set up. And whom he would, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. So Daniel is reminding him of the story of his grandfather. I'm sure there's no way that Belshazzar did not know the story of his grandfather. But it appears from what we read early in chapter 5, in spite of knowing what happened to his grandfather, he had not learned the lesson himself. And the lesson was lost on the grandson, who apparently didn't take it to heart himself. TR verse 22, and thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives and thy concubines, have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways hast thou not glorified? Daniel he's being very bold here. He just called all the gods of Babylon gods that don't exist. He said, your gods that you've worshipped using the things from the house of the God of heaven, you've used them to worship your gods that are of gold, silver, iron, wood, and stone, that see not nor hear not, gods that aren't even gods. Now that's a pretty bold thing to say to a man who's named Belshazzar, who's named after the god Bel of Babylon, which is another name for the god Marduk we've talked about in the past, the chief god of the Babylonians. This is the god for whom Belshazzar is named, and Daniel just blasphemed Bel and all the other gods of Babylon. TR? It would be akin to that, you're right. So that's a very bold statement that Daniel makes. He said, you took the things out of the house of the true God, and you've used them in the worship of your gods that aren't even gods. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. So Daniel tells him, that hand you saw, it was the hand of the God whom you've blasphemed and dishonored. Now, if you didn't even know what the writing was and what it meant, just knowing that the hand was from the God whose vessels you just drank out of immorally, that would not be a good sign. You really don't have to know what the message says to know it ain't going to be a good message, if I can use my southern terminology. It ain't going to be good. And this is the writing that was written. Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. Now, I'm going to stop here for just a moment before we read on and get you to look up here at the whiteboard. In both the Hebrew language and the Aramaic language, which would have been probably the language that was spoken by many of the different peoples of the Babylonian Empire, but not the Babylonians themselves, the Aramaic language was spoken by most of the people of the ancient world in that part of the country, in what we call the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia. Aramaic was still a later form of Aramaic, was the language that was spoken in Jesus' day there in the land of Palestine. So it's an ancient language that was around for literally thousands of years. Now, the Chaldean language was the language of the Babylonians, but even the Babylonians were familiar with the Aramaic language spoken by the Assyrians to the north and many of the other people they had conquered in their empire. Neither the Hebrew language nor the Aramaic language have vowels in their languages. It's a language of just consonants, and the vowels are sort of naturally inserted as you read the consonants. So what we see here is that the writing that was written would have been written just consonants. Now, I don't know either Hebrew or Aramaic. I know just enough Greek to get me in trouble. This was written undoubtedly either in Hebrew or Aramaic. Daniel knew the language, or it appears that he probably knew the language. If not, God supernaturally showed him what the language was. But mene, mene, tekel upharsin. So if we leave the vowels out, it would look like this. Mene, mene, tekel, and then the upharsin. It is the plural of the word Perez. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, or Perez. It's probably not hard to understand why the magicians, astrologers, soothsayers, when they saw these letters, they didn't know what the message was. there are several different words that could be made of these letters depending on which vowels are inserted in the letters. Maybe the Chaldeans knew or had a good idea of what the message was, and they just didn't want to be the ones to present it to King Belshazzar, just like we saw was the case with Nebuchadnezzar's interpretation. But Daniel undoubtedly understood what God was trying to say here, because it was the Holy Spirit who helped Daniel to know what God was conveying to the king. So keep in mind what we just said about those vowels and consonants, and let's read on here. This is the interpretation of the thing. Meaning, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. The word meaning literally means numbered. That's what the word means by itself. Meaning means numbered. The word tekel means weighed. The word Perez, which is the form of the word upharsin, means divided. So as far as the Chaldeans were concerned, the astrologers, the soothsayers, all they knew that the message was that was written on the wall were the words numbered, weighed, divided. So to them, with no context, even if you saw the message and read it, numbered, weighed, divided, there's not, you could say, even though they could read the message, there's nothing to tell them what the message means. Numbered, weighed, divided. Okay, there's the message. We don't know what it means. Perhaps it was so obvious that they couldn't help but know what it meant. After all, there's an enemy camped outside the city walls. There's a hand that just wrote this message in the plaster, and the message is a message that couldn't mean something good. So maybe they had a feel for the fact this isn't a good message, and they just didn't want to present it. Or maybe they genuinely didn't know what to make of these words, because the words just by themselves, you could say, well, they could mean anything. Numbered, weighed, divided. But given the context of what's going on, and Daniel's understanding of the fact that they had just brought the vessels out of the house of God and drunken wine out of them in their immorality that was going on in the king's throne room, Daniel was allowed of the Holy Spirit to know exactly what these words were intended to mean. Numbered, weighed, divided. So back to our text here, we see what they mean, what God intended them to mean. Meaning, it didn't just mean numbered, it meant God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. In other words, God has counted your kingdom and you're done. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. You can picture the scales, the balance scales, something being weighed, you've been found wanting. You've been outweighed. You're worthless. You've been found wanting. And then Perez, which is the derivative of the word upharsin, thy kingdom is divided. It's interesting because this word, Perez, if you change one vowel in the word, one vowel that you insert, it can either mean the word divided, or it can mean the Persians. It's one letter difference in the Aramaic language between divided and Persians. God either has a sense of humor, or it's just that He's so brilliant it had a dual meaning. Your kingdom is divided, and by the way, it's divided between the Medes and the Persians, which is virtually the same word as the word divided. By the way, those are the same people that were camped right outside the wall of the city. So Daniel was able to interpret the message. It's certainly not a good message, but here's Belshazzar. He's afraid of just the mystery of the unknown of what the message is. You know, a lot of times that's the truth in life. The mystery of the unknown is more terrifying than actually knowing what something is. But now he knows what it is. Daniel doesn't give him good news. It's not a good message. But at least now he knows what the message means. And don't you imagine that King Belshazzar, even hearing the message, don't you imagine he had to have thought to himself, at least somewhat, well, if that's all it is, I'm not too worried. I've got that double wall outside with the moat in between and the army on the walls. I have to believe that as bad a message as this was, he probably went back to being not too worried once he knew what the message was. Yes, sir?
I think it strikes me as those people, none of them were familiar with God that actually did anything at all, and so that was a lot of talk for them.
Well, that's a good point, because they were accustomed to gods that didn't do anything. That's right. So they're about to see a God who is able to do something and is going to do something. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now Daniel had already told him, keep your gifts, I don't want them, give them to somebody else. But here's Belshazzar, of course he's going to go through the motions anyway. I kind of think going through all the motions there, he must have thought his kingdom, whatever was going to happen, wasn't going to happen anytime soon. He wasn't counting on anything happening soon, or he wouldn't have gone through all this commotion to give these rewards, to a Jew from Jerusalem who worshiped the same God as the God of those gold and silver vessels he was drinking and boozing it up out of.
It surprises me that Daniel would even let him put that gold chain around his neck and all that.
I don't imagine he had too much choice at that point, but we're about to see, I think Daniel already understands what the king doesn't, that none of this matters. It's all temporary. In fact, it was more temporary than the king realized. Let's continue on. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. That would be about 62. 62. 62. So God didn't waste any time with old King Belshazzar. He thought he knew more than God did. He thought he was safe. He thought he was comfortable and protected. Well, he might have been safe and comfortable and protected when it just came to those gods that weren't able to do anything. But from a God that was a real God, the true and living God, he wasn't safe. And God wasted no time. That's exactly right. But he's about to see, just like Nebuchadnezzar learned who was in charge and who rules in the affairs of men, he's about to learn the same lesson. That's a good question. Mary asked the question, who slew him? Well, I'm going to erase these words that we have up here on the board. Here's some of the exciting part of the story that's not actually in the text here, but I want to let you know what happened that night all those years ago. And I wrote down the date and walked right out and left it at home, so I don't have the date with me. But historians actually know the exact day, month, and year that the occasion occurred. Here we have the huge city of Babylon and the Euphrates River that flowed from north to south through the city. It's got the double walls around the huge city with a moat in between. The Euphrates River, the mighty Euphrates, flowed through the city, providing the fresh water. It flowed under the walls, and the way that it flowed under the walls is that there were arches created in the bottom portion of the wall where the river flowed, and it would have looked something like this if you were looking at the wall. Here's the water level. Here's the wall that goes on in each direction. There would have been an arch, something similar to this, with iron bars going down into the river that would prevent anyone or any boat from getting under the walls into the city. But here's what happened. The Medes and the Persians had located an ancient lake bed that had long since dried up to the north of the city in this general area. And north of the city of Babylon, they had begun digging canals, a canal that would go from the Euphrates River to that dried lake bed. And when they opened the sluice and let the water run, it lowered the level of the Euphrates River temporarily as the water was flooding downhill into this dried up ancient lake bed. The water level from here to here was lower than it normally would have been for just a time until this filled up. In the night, the middle of the night, that night, the water level dropped enough feet that the soldiers of the Medes and the Persians, we're told by the ancient historian Herodotus, were able to wade under the iron grate, and they were able to wade in the water up to about their waist, but they were able to get under the iron grate. Once in, they captured the closest gate to them, overthrew the guards who were not expecting anything, weren't watchful because they didn't think their city could be taken. And as soon as the gate was captured, in flooded in the middle of the night the entire army of the Medes and the Persians. And it is said by more than one ancient historian that when the sun came up the next morning, the Babylonians in the city did not even know their city had been captured. It was almost the equivalent to the battle being won without a shot being fired, because most of the city was captured without any fighting even taking place. The city just awoke the next morning to find out that they were no longer Babylonians, they were under the Medes and the Persians. That's right. The majority of the army would have been away with Daddy fighting. And the mighty city of Babylon fell in a single night, just as God had prophesied. It's just a reminder that the world might think they're safe, impregnable against God. But God can bring to naught any walls that He wishes to do so. In a single night, the mighty city of Babylon, that had never been defeated in a siege in 1,000 years, fell to the Medes and the Persians. And the Medes and the Persians, we're going to see them again beginning in the very next chapter. But the Medes and the Persians, this was a confederation of two different groups of people who lived to the east of Babylon. These people both lived in what is today the modern country of Iran, however you want to say it. Babylon's the modern day country of Iraq. To the east is Iran, the land of the Persians, and the Medes lived in that area as well. This was a confederation of two groups of people that were tired of being lorded over by the Babylonians. They were fighting for their independence from Babylon. They had united together, And in this one night, the capital city of Babylon falls to the Medes and the Persians. The man who is said to have been the one who took the city, there you see in the last verse, Darius the Mede. Secular historians said for years and years that there was no such person as Darius the Mede, because the next person we see that is over the entire Medo-Persian Empire is a man that's also in the Scriptures, a man known as Cyrus the Great. And there's no mention in secular historical records of Darius the Mede. But it appears that the title Darius may have actually been not a name, but a title for one of the king's top generals. He was the Darius, in other words. A title, not a name. And it is true that the army that was besieging the city of Babylon had one of the number one generals of the Medes and Persians who conquered the city, and he was given control of the city as the temporary governor of the city until Cyrus the Great came in and accepted the entire territory. So this man here, Darius the Mede, was undoubtedly the leader of the Medo-Persian army that captured the city of Babylon that night. And I'm pretty sure he and or his men who were acting under his command they're the ones who slew King Belshazzar, probably in his own throne room that night. T.R.?
Just because the man could have been of the Persian army or under Cyrus doesn't mean he was. He could have been over the army of the other country of the Medes, because the country of the Medes was separate from the Persian Empire. They had just aligned themselves together. So historians may be looking in the wrong place. They may not have even, in fact, they may not even say that the Medes existed.
Well, T.R. is speculating as to who Darius the Mede might be. T.R., I'll give you one other piece of investigative information that we're going to come back to later in the book of Daniel because it's significant for one of the prophecies later on. But the Medo-Persian Empire was characterized during its existence in the beginning part of this confederation. The Medes were kind of the leaders of the confederation, especially militarily. But as time goes on, the Medes kind of wane in comparison to the Persians, who become the dominant, prominent side of the confederation. That's why today we read about the mighty Persian Empire, not the Median Empire. So the Medes were of note at the beginning of the confederation, but they kind of began to drop to the wayside and the Persians rise to prominence. That may be one explanation for why this individual is not remembered also in secular history. Mary?
This Darius the Median, did he know Daniel, and did he go ahead and give him the third kingdom, or?
He doesn't know him yet, but you're getting ahead of the story. You always try to get ahead of the preacher. No, I'm just joking. I'm just joking, Mary. It's a good question. It's a good question, and we'll tackle that one, Lord willing, next Sunday evening. He doesn't know Daniel or who Daniel is or that Daniel even exists yet, but he's about to meet him. That's a good question. All right, well, next week, Lord willing, will be Daniel chapter 6, and it's the most famous story in the Old Testament other than David and Goliath. It's the story of Daniel in the lion's den. There's more to it than what you've learned growing up in Sunday school, so come be here next week, and Lord willing, we'll dive into it, and we'll get all the good that there is to get out of it. Anything else, Brother John?
Do we know still where this Babylon was?
Yes, sir, we do. Saddam Hussein was attempting to rebuild the ancient city of Babylon. He had actually excavated many of the ancient sites of the city of Babylon and even discovered the Ishtar Gate, which was down here. And he had unearthed some of the statues or carvings of Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar's head, and he was attempting to have monuments to himself put right beside the monuments to Nebuchadnezzar that he had unearthed, because it is said, whether true or not, I don't know, it's said that Saddam Hussein viewed himself as the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar. And that was what he thought he was doing in the desert, was rebuilding the Babylonian Empire. And the truth is, there is going to be a rebuilt Babylonian Empire of sorts in the end times, but we'll talk more about Babylon in the end times as we go through. That's a good question, though. I don't remember what the actual name of the city is in modern-day Iraq, Brother John, but we'll look it up. I'll try to find it before next week. All right, any other questions, comments, observations? All right, Lord, thank you for a chance to study the book of Daniel. Help us, I pray, to be wise. Lord, just as we see recorded later in the book of Daniel, help us to turn many to righteousness, that we might shine as the brightness of the firmament. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.